Welcome to the Wealth Standing Podcast. This is episode 463. Today is February 15th, 2025. I'm your host, John Pugliano. I'm also the founder and money manager at investablewealth.com. Hey, in today's episode, I want to take a different twist on the headlines and all the talk about executive orders and tariffs and their impacts and step back and take an economic principle that can be quite complex, but we're going to boil it down to make it very simple so that you can have an understanding of it to apply it to your investing portfolio and equally, or maybe even more importantly, to your career development and your own personal growth. What am I talking about? Comparative advantage. Comparative advantage in terms of market forces. Now, there's a lot of talk about free trade and capitalism and what tariffs are doing or aren't doing to disturb all that and disrupt it and all the world order. And listen, I think what's going on in the media, I think more than anything, is somewhere between gaslighting and a psych op. And the reason I say that is because, well, let's step back a second. First off, there is no free trade. All the global trade is based on individual governments' trade policies, and they influence that trade either directly or indirectly by the policies and the regulations that they create. So whether something is tariffed or not, to the extent that it crosses the borders into another country, isn't influenced by free trade, it's influenced by government policy. Whether that's environmental regulations, tax regulations, intellectual property regulations, or even just cultural bias that's encouraged and promoted by the government on its general population. So forget everything you're hearing about tariffs and focus on regulation and deregulation. That's really where this is all headed, and it has nothing to do, now let me step back. It doesn't have anything to do with Trump. As you've heard me say in the past, Trump isn't a force unto himself. Trump is just part of the trend. This has been going on since long before his first term, and it's not just the U.S. Non-coincidentally, Trump got elected the same year that Britain had its Brexit. This is just part of an overall global trend that's being driven by demographics and technology and social change. And what we want to do is figure out how we can profit from that, right? We don't want to fight against the forces. We want to use those to our advantage. So forget about tariffs and let's talk about what economists call comparative advantage. Because whether you're protecting your local economy or not even protecting, let's just say you're influencing your country's economy, whether you're doing it through tariffs or through regulation or through taxes or through other policies, what you're doing is you're trying to distort and control natural market forces. What are these market forces? Well, they're driven by comparative advantage. Now let's break this down into the simplest of terms. Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage against the country of Japan when it comes to the exploration and development of fossil fuels, namely oil, right? Petrochemicals. Now, that's an example of two different countries. We can look regionally in the United States. Texas has that same comparative advantage against the state of Nevada. So in my example, Texas and Saudi Arabia are not dominant in oil production, primarily because of government policies. Now, step back. I'm not saying that their governments and institutions haven't worked together to take advantage of that natural resource. But what I want to point out here is that it is a natural force. Saudi Arabia and Texas have oil reserves which give them a comparative advantage against other nations or other states or other regions. And those other regions like Japan or Nevada, they could have industrial policy where they try and develop their industry. They could invest more in exploration of oil and natural gas. They could put tariffs on imports. They could do all kinds of policy decisions, but it really wouldn't move the needle in the fact that Saudi Arabia and Texas have comparative advantages in terms of oil exploration and production compared to just about anywhere else in the world. That's the market force. I use this example with Texas and Saudi Arabia because in a lot of ways, especially in terms of like Saudi Arabia, they have virtually nothing else going for them, right? They're a desert. They're in a fairly remote part of the world. They don't have major concentrations of big markets around them like London, Paris, Chicago, Beijing. No city in Saudi Arabia has that kind of access to markets. But what Saudi Arabia does have, and the reason they're as wealthy and as much of a global power as they are, is because they've taken advantage of their comparative advantage against everybody else, and they've developed their natural resource of oil. And so for a country like Japan to develop their comparative advantages and to grow their economy, rather than putting up tariffs and roadblocks and fighting Saudi Arabia's natural advantage that they have in terms of oil, it's to Japan's advantage to bring in as much inexpensive or comparatively inexpensive energy in the form of oil from Saudi Arabia than it is for them to try and develop their own oil exploration market. They can take the the comparatively cheap oil from Saudi Arabia, bring it into Japan, and then use Japan's natural resources and Japan's comparative advantage and use that energy to develop their own markets. That's how, quote, free trade really works. But again, it's nothing about free trade. There's nothing free about it. It's just market forces. Market forces involve using efficiencies in the world to take what one people or one country or one area's advantages and what they're good at and export those to areas that would have a higher cost in that regard, so that that area can develop their own natural resources and their own comparative advantages. Now, getting back to the United States and the difference between Nevada and Texas. Let's go back about 100 years ago. Nevada didn't develop their oil and gas industry because, it's so much cheaper to bring it in from Texas or Oklahoma. It wouldn't have made rational sense in terms of comparative advantage. Now, the sad part about Nevada, much like my home state of Utah, we're a desert. A mountain desert, but we're a desert nonetheless. And so desert countries, much like Saudi Arabia, if they don't have a major natural resource like petroleum, well, then they don't have a whole lot of comparative advantages. And they have to institute policies and social type institutions to leverage the small amount of resources that they do have. And so, going back to the early 1930s, what did Nevada do to give itself a comparative advantage to other regions and areas of the country? They legalized gambling. And specifically, it was gambling in the form of casino-type gaming. There were a lot of places where you could gamble in terms of lotteries or horse races, different things like that. But where Nevada really saw an advantage was to use their relative proximity to California and the fact that a city like Las Vegas was a whistle stop along the railroads, which was the primary way you traveled from east to west back in those days. So if you were going to California, specifically if you were going to Los Angeles, you pretty much had to pass through Las Vegas on a train stop, and it was still another day or so before you got to civilization on the West Coast. And so you could stop over in Vegas, stay at a hotel, get a meal, and gamble. And again, gambling in terms of gaming, where it's fairly low cost in terms of providing the betting environment, right? It's not like you have to have stables of horses and horse races and things. You can simply just deal up some cards or have a roulette wheel. Or even better yet, a mechanical machine which doesn't take any type of human interaction as far as the casino is concerned, and that's, really where the slot machines came into and what a cash cow they are. And so Nevada developed its economy by creating a comparative advantage in terms of creating these institutions that were based on policy differentials. Think about what I'm saying here. Nevada looked at their situation and said, we don't have a lot of comparative advantages. And these other states have put up, quote, barriers to entertainment in terms of making gambling illegal. And so we're going to simply just change our laws and make it legal, and that'll allow us to create an industry where we have a comparative advantage against everybody else. This kind of gets back to my discussions about what's existential and what's simply policy. Nevada could have totally lost their advantage if all the other states would have deregulated and legalized gambling as well. But they didn't. And in fact, once Nevada really got up and running, they spent a lot of money on lobbying and encouraging other states to maintain their strict laws on gambling so that Nevada would have a comparative advantage against everybody else. By the way, let's step back. I mentioned Nevada did this in the early 30s. I think it was 1931. And think back to history. When was that? That was right in the heart of the Great Depression, That was right at a time, just a few years after the great crash on Wall Street. This is when people didn't have disposable income, and not only in the United States, but the whole world was going through a global depression. And yet, what did Nevada do? They built their future on providing a discretionary service that no one needed at a time when people supposedly didn't have discretionary income. I say supposedly because apparently they must have, because Las Vegas and gambling in Nevada became a major source of income and revenue through the Depression and into what we have today. In fact, it's so strong that even if all the other states finally did legalize gambling and gaming and such, like we've seen on Indian reservations, Nevada has such an advantage. Not Nevada, let me step back. Las Vegas has such an advantage, such an institutional advantage, that it's expanded beyond just gambling, and it also includes entertainment, that, overnight Las Vegas wouldn't go bankrupt if everybody else legalized casino gaming, but it would put a dent in the overall Nevada economy, because certainly the smaller areas outside of Las Vegas would suffer. And while Las Vegas may remain the mecca of gambling, people do only have so much discretionary income that they can set aside for gambling. And while I don't think the casinos would go bankrupt, I do think the rate of growth would certainly slow down. And certainly that is the case. The growth of the casino gambling part of the revenue has certainly slowed down over the years, but certainly Las Vegas has maintained its economy by diversifying and expanding, and been more about entertainment and dining and hosting conventions and conferences. In any case, you see where I'm trying to go here. Certain places of the world have geographic or other forms of comparative advantage over other regions. And even in, while we're talking about kind of entertainment and things, why is Disney World in Orlando, Florida, and not in Fargo, North Dakota? When Walt Disney wanted to expand Disneyland and create a Disney World, he could have gone anywhere in the United States to do it. He picked Florida because there was a lot of inexpensive farmland. Back then they were growing, citrus fruits. He could buy a vast amount of farmland fairly inexpensively, and that's what he did. But why didn't he buy farmland in North Dakota? Well, Orlando has much better weather, probably 80% of the year compared to North Dakota. So to create a vacation destination, it was going to be a whole lot easier to do it in Florida than it would be in the Dakotas. So comparative advantages are all around us. And getting back here to the point about all the drama and emphasis on tariffs, well, that's not going to change comparative advantages. If a nation can truly produce something at a lower cost and at a higher quality, then that will find its way into the global market, because that is simply market forces. But what can and what is and what will impact global trade, much more so than tariffs, is simply going to be policy decisions made in the United States. And this is a big shift in our national security strategy that's been going on now for over a decade. And again, you heard me say before the election, it doesn't matter whether Tweedledum or Tweedledee gets elected. There are long-term trends which are driving the United States economy. And Trump is obviously going to do it differently than Harris would have, or Biden, or Obama, or Bush before him. But regardless of what empty suit is in the White House, we are moving in a direction where trade between nations is being drastically impacted. And whether it's done directly through tariffs, like are in the headlines right now, or whether it's done through the previous administration's policies of things that were disguised, like Build Back Better, or the Inflation Reduction Act, or the CHIPS Act. Again, regardless of what they were named, what was the whole purpose of them? To increase and develop the reindustrialization of the United States, whether it was building green energy or bringing pharmaceutical production back to the United States, because during the pandemic we found out that even just our basic supplies of antibiotics weren't available in this country anymore. Or whether it's battery technology or renewable energies or building infrastructure, call it what you want. But for more than a decade now, economic policies are changing and becoming more nationalistic, not only in the United States, but all around the world. But the impact is being felt the most because of policies and decisions made in the United States, because we remain the largest market, and certainly the largest market that's open to all the other countries. And that's what's changing. And my argument today is that it isn't going to change through tariffs. That may be a short-term policy decision that goes into effect now, but long-term, trade is going to be impacted and affected by simple policy decisions. Policy decisions in terms of intellectual property, in terms of tax policy, in terms of environmental regulation. And so forget what you're hearing about tariffs. Start focusing on what's going to happen with future policy decisions, and I think you can put that under the category of deregulation. Let's step back here and look at this from a historical perspective. The United States has hollowed out its manufacturing base over the last 50 years or so, not because other countries had significant comparative advantages against the United States. The United States could be a manufacturing powerhouse if it chose to be, because energy costs are generally less expensive here and more abundant than in other places. The scale of the U.S. economy is such that we could justify having that manufacturing here as it used to be. The workforce, the universities, the intellectual property, the design and development, it's all here. But because of policy decisions, the United States has chosen to farm out its manufacturing. Policies and roadblocks were put up in the United States that made it more competitive and comparative advantage to be made somewhere else. These were not natural barriers, they were policy barriers. One major driving force for that goes back 80 years ago to the end of the Cold War, and that's where the National Strategic Defense Policy or strategy was to increase trade among nations, and in particular for the United States to build up allies that would be based on trade. The theory being that if you're trading with someone, you're not fighting against them. And so things like the Marshall Plan after World War II went into effect to build up Europe. And we wanted to stabilize the country of Japan by building up their industry. And that concept just spread and spread to where we had an alliance of friendly nations that could freely trade with the United States. We strengthened their economies by sacrificing our trade and specifically our manufacturing base. That made good sense for creating a peaceful global alliance until it didn't. And the fallacy of that policy was that you're not only strengthening your friends and your allies, but you're also strengthening the economies of your adversaries and your foes. And so if you fast forward 80 years, what started out as a national security strategy to strengthen the U.S. and provide global peace is now a detriment to national security because the United States no longer has the basic industrial manufacturing base to produce critical items to support its national defense strategy. And again, this just didn't happen overnight. This is something that's been realized for over a decade now, and policies are slowly being implemented to change that. And it won't all be done through tariffs. Again, this is just a head fake or gaslighting in the media. Watch for deregulation, which encourages and promotes the natural comparative advantage that the United States has over other regions and nations and countries. And the advantages that the United States has are immense. That's how the economy got to be so big to begin with. That's why the United States was able to sacrifice its manufacturing base to promote global stability and world peace. But again, those days are over. And whether it's Tweedledum or Tweedledee, red team or blue team, we're moving in that more nationalistic, industrial policy-driven environment to promote comparative advantages in the United States versus promoting them among our allies. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight. And I'm not saying that everything is going to be made in the United States. What I'm saying is that world trade has gotten out of equilibrium, where countries that don't have a comparative advantage, a natural comparative advantage, have gained one because of policy decisions. But those policy decisions are being shifted more in favor of the United States. And this isn't just going to impact adversaries. I mean, look at a friendly country like Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. I don't know what percentage of their economy is made up by pharmaceutical sector and pharmaceutical manufacturing, but certainly on a global scale, the Republic of Ireland punches way above its weight in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing. And this is not to take anything away from the Irish people. They've done an exceptional job with pharmaceuticals and other industries where they've created a policy, much like Nevada did back in the 1930s, well, probably go back to the 1970s or maybe even earlier. Ireland started constructing economic policies that would give them a lower tax base and encourage foreign investment into their country to create jobs and opportunities. Step back here a second. Back in 2016, I was optimistic about Brexit because I thought that the British would have the sense to look at Ireland and see what Ireland had done. And if Britain had moved in that direction at all of deregulation and lower taxes, then instead of them having the stagnant economy that they have today, I think that the UK could have become the Singapore of the Atlantic if they would have looked more to Ireland. But I digress. Hey, in any case, Ireland's done a great job through policy decisions. They don't have a natural comparative advantage to manufacture and to have the amount of corporations that they do simply, because of their resources. They've done that through 50 years or more of industrial policy that has favored investment in manufacturing on their island. And while I don't see something like the pharmaceutical leaving Ireland anytime soon, again, the United States woke up during the pandemic and realized how much basic medical things are not made here anymore, and how much of that is with adversaries like China or with lower quality producers that may not necessarily be adversaries but also aren't necessarily our friends like India, and how far away those countries are from a supply chain situation. That stuff could be made here in the United States like it used to be. And so I think the United States is going to take a hard look, as we are, at our pharmaceutical policies and regulations from the FDA. And without tariffs, but simply tax policies and manufacturing policies and policies around intellectual property and policies about where the government can and can't buy and source its Medicare and Medicaid drugs from, that could all have a major impact on countries like India and countries like China, but also consequently could have detrimental effects on friendly nations like Ireland. All that is coming. All that is already happening now. And as an investor, I think it's wise to be adjusting your portfolio to take advantage of the reindustrialization in the United States. This isn't a short-term trend. This isn't to say that industrial companies and their stock prices won't, go down 25% this year. We have no idea what's going to happen day to day. But over the next 5 to 10 to more years, the United States is going through an industrialization renaissance. And I think your portfolio should be constructed to take advantage of that. And more importantly, so should your career. Listen, if you're, in your 40s or younger, then you have 20, 25, 30 or more years, right? A whole lifetime of career ahead of you. And I think you should be focusing on those areas that will be the growth sectors, which is a confluence of technology and manufacturing and industrialization. So it's not just about industrialization. It's about the industries that can take technology and digitization in the form of productivity improvements that will come from robotics and automation. So in your own personal life and your career development, move in those directions. Learn about coding, learn about cybersecurity, learn about design and computer-aided drafting and things, but also learn about the nuts and bolts of how to fix and repair things and how to manufacture products. Because even to the extent that things are going to be made overseas, because they will, if they can be made there with a real comparative advantage, we still need things serviced and supported here in this country. Just in terms of energy generation alone, the opportunities abound in your own personal life. And again, look towards your own comparative advantage. You have talents and abilities that are unique and different from everybody else's. That's where your comparative advantage exists. Find out what your God-given talent is and use that to create products and services that benefit other people. So regardless of what disadvantages or handicaps you may think you have, if you're hearing my voice and you're living and you're breathing and you're in particular in the United States, then the opportunities because of technology and now this reemergence of industrialization in the United States means that you're living in a time that's never had more opportunity. Again, step back. When did Las Vegas put itself on the path to be the world-leading mecca of entertainment and gambling. It was in 1931 at the heart of the Depression when people didn't have disposable income. My friends, I'm telling you, opportunities abound. Go take advantage of them. And hey, as always, until next time, this is John Pugliano wishing you the very best returns.